and they had been kind of humiliated in the eyes, not just of conservatives, but in the eyes of their peers, of people who they respect and regard as moral and political equals. That is when they decided, Penny Pritzker, call Claudine Gay, we're not doing this anymore.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Reihan Salam. Today's episode is about higher education, and more specifically, how a rigid diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology has overtaken elite universities and, increasingly, American public life. Few reporters have followed the woke takeover of American institutions and the corrosion of our universities more closely than our guest. Aaron Sibarium is a staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon and a graduate of Yale University. He was the subject of a recent Politico profile which dubbed him the Gen Z Investigative Reporter rocking conservative media, and his extensive and impeccable reporting on former Harvard President Claudine Gay's academic record contributed to her resignation. His work has appeared in City Journal, The Free Press, and National Review, and he joins us today to speak about his work on campus culture. Aaron, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh gosh, you are very unusual in that it's long been a struggle for conservatives to really penetrate and understand the discourse, the climate within elite institutions. You, however, have broken a slew of stories, even before the gay controversy at Harvard. At Yale Law School, it's been a veritable hunting ground for you in describing some of the ways in which this institution has changed and has sought to marginalize and stifle dissenting voices. So I'm curious if you could talk to us a bit about that. Why do these institutions matter? Why has there been so little understanding of the way these institutions have changed in recent years?
Sure. So you I think, maybe alluded to something important in the way you set up your opening remarks, which is that although I report in a very adversarial way on these institutions, I am also a product of them. I did attend Yale University, not Yale Law School. I won't have my good name besmirched by any false affiliation with that hive of scum and villainy. But I did attend Yale University, which is not quite as bad, but almost as bad. And I would say that as a result of being ensconced in these elite spaces, I do have a sense of what the culture is like, perhaps a more developed intuition than some outsiders would have for where there might be a story, or, what kind of thing really does seem, what tips do seem credible, like they really are going to lead to an insane blockbuster scoop versus what just is too good to be true. My intuition isn't always accurate. I have to say, there was a story about a trap house gate, right? The kid who got bullied by administrators for using the term trap house in an email that I must confess I was very skeptical of when I first got the tip. Nah, they didn't really say that. Come on, that can't be there. And then I heard the audio recording. Oh no, they really did intimate that the Federalist Society was triggering, and that the kid had to apologize for having the gall to invite his classmates to a party where they would be eating fried chicken because that somehow was a racist trope associated with Black people being fat. I'm not joking. This was said on tape for anyone who hasn't. Sorry,
just to be clear. So what your initial instinct was, your spidey sense was, this seems like a caricature. This seems like a
how could this be? Yeah, how could this be real? Like, how could they have really told a kid that he was complicit in systemic racism for using the term trap house in an email, when Chapo Trap House is a widely respected progressive podcast? It just, come on, they can't be this insane, right? And they can't have actually told him that his being in the Federalist Society had been triggering to his classmates and was part of why they were hauling him into the DEI office to browbeat him into issuing a Maoist-style apology. That can't really be true, right? Well, then it was all true, and we got it on tape. So every so often, I'm a little too skeptical of how crazy it can be, and then I'm proven wrong. But generally speaking, I would say I've kind of developed a more refined intuition for what is and is not a real story. And I think it does help that I graduated from one of these places.
But Aaron, this also leads us to this other question, something that you, I'm sure, have heard many times. Gosh, Aaron, you are covering these institutions. You're providing the saturation coverage of goings-on and administrative emails at Yale Law School. How much does this matter really? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts when you think about the transmission belt from these elite post-secondary institutions into, call it government, the upper reaches of the corporate sector and what have you. I mean, tell me about the relationship as you see it. How much do these places matter? How much does the culture of elite higher education actually wind up shaping the upper echelons of American life writ large?
Well, 4 of our Supreme Court justices are graduates of Yale Law School. Another, God knows how many federal judges are graduates of Yale Law School. Catherine McKinnon, who basically invented the modern concept of hostile environment law, was a graduate of Yale Law School. Rebecca Slaughter and Lena Khan, 2 of the commissioners on the FTC, are graduates of Yale Law School. I would note that Khan's tenure at the FTC has been very tumultuous and has marked a number of very significant policy changes by the agency. And for her own part, Rebecca Slaughter suggested that we make antitrust law anti-racist and proposed modeling American antitrust law off of South Africa's antitrust law. For those who don't know, South African antitrust law basically approves mergers and acquisitions based in part on the racial composition of the resulting corporate boards, leading to massive endemic corruption and spiraling unemployment and all sorts of other pathologies. So these are all Yale Law graduates who occupy very important positions of power, who have some crazy ideas. So it's pretty obvious why I think something like Yale Law School matters. It just produces such a disproportionate share of our legal and policy elites that you can't really ignore what the ideological center of gravity is at that institution, and or even what the more kind of ideological fringes at that institution, because what is once fringe can become mainstream. Critical race theory used to be a genuinely fringe idea taught in a few law school seminars, and now it is far more mainstream in legal academia and certainly extremely mainstream in education schools and other disciplines that produce teachers and doctors, right? And all sorts of other important professions. And that's just legal academia, right, that we can talk about. When you broaden your analysis to just the graduates of Harvard College or the graduates of Yale University, you really are talking about, if not the majority of people who make the life and death decisions at the highest levels of government and law, then certainly a very large percentage of them. So it matters a great deal. And I would say for anyone who's skeptical of that proposition, a lot of people were like, they'll grow out of it. They're just a few college kids. That was the line in 2014, 2015. Well, 2020 comes around and suddenly the culture wars and eruptions that we had been seeing on campus find their way into Zoom calls at the New York Times. And people are losing their jobs for publishing mainstream arguments by sitting U.S. senators. So the media, right, was also effective. And at a certain point, I think my kind of countercharge to the skeptics would be, look, can you name an important institution in American life that has not been affected by this ideology? We've seen COVID drugs in 3 U.S. states rationed off the basis of race in violation of the 14th Amendment. That is a real thing that happened. No one disputes the factual basis of my reporting on that. It happened. When we're at the point where drugs are being allocated based on skin color by governments, can you really claim that this stuff is marginal or just a few college kids? I think it's at this point, that is a self-evidently absurd and false proposition.
I wonder, Aaron, if you could talk to us a bit about the transmission belt. How does this work? So, for example, one line of argument could be, well, look, if you look at younger cohorts, they just happen to be really passionate about racial justice, social justice, about these ideas of representation, this progressive racialism, call it what you will, and that these institutions are merely responding to the fact that there is this, they're obviously seeking to select bright, capable, ambitious young people, and lo and behold, they happen to adhere to this set of ideas, that it's almost this kind of demand-side response. There's another view, which is that actually these are institutions that are in some degree actively shaping their student bodies. There is a kind of cultural reproduction happening within these academic disciplines that is shaping the cultural playing field. Not to say that these are necessarily mutually exclusive, but I'm curious how you think about that question.
Well, yeah, so I certainly don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I suspect both are going on to some degree. My provisional mental model of this is that most of the kids arriving to these elite institutions are already pretty left-wing. They may become more left-wing when they get there, but I actually think that's maybe the wrong way to think about it. It's more that they come in with a set of kind of often inchoate intuitions about politics and society, and are then given a vocabulary and conceptual apparatus that kind of refines those intuitions into the doctrines that we call wokeness or what have you. And they're also, I think, habituated into certain norms and scripts of elite behavior, right? And socialized through their time at Yale or Harvard. But that socialization can only happen because when they come in, they're already buying into many of the implicit premises of.
And I wonder if part of that is because the institutions themselves send signals. That is about the kind of student we want to attract, the kind of behaviors, political proclivities that we consider praiseworthy. I almost wonder if, ambitious young people are responding to signals sent about what will be praised, celebrated.
Yes, I think that they are. I also think that because the long march through the institutions was very long indeed, it's important to emphasize that the way in which U.S. history, for example, is taught in many secondary schools, it may not be full-on Derek Bell critical race theory, but it contains a lot of the kind of subterranean impulses and premises of that worldview. And I think the conquest of elite institutions by this ideology means that it's now, and for some time has been, implicit in the education of students of not just, say, Dalton, but of many, good public schools throughout the United States. And for various reasons that we don't have time to go into, I do think it is a sociological fact that on average, the smartest people who tend to make it to these elite schools, based largely on merit, are in fact more liberal. It's not, I don't think it's just that schools are discriminating, although they may do that on the basis of ideology. I think it is also that just they come from a culture that inculcates certain inchoate premises that then, again, it's you get a more sophisticated vocabulary once you're in college, but like they're already kind of coming in partly brainwashed. I do think that's part of what's going on. Now, when you get into the corporate sector and kind of beyond college, there, I think it's a mix of you're getting the kids who've been kind of refined and shaped through both the secondary education system and the higher education system. That's part of it. But then I think it's also there's another story about just the growth of DEI and civil rights bureaucracy and the incentives that these various bureaucracies have to entrench, to self-perpetuate, and to punish anyone whose views might be a threat to their hegemony. There's kind of a bureaucratic turf war dynamic that then gets layered on. But yeah, I guess in brief, that's kind of my mental model for thinking about all of it.
One reason I was so keen to speak with you is the really central role your brilliant, incisive reporting on Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, has had on the national discourse and also on the leadership of Harvard University now that Claudine Gay has resigned in light of the plagiarism allegations that you raised and pursued pretty doggedly. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about Claudine Gay herself as a figure who may or may not be emblematic of some of these larger trends in elite academia. She's someone who is a graduate of Exeter, Stanford. Her PhD is from Harvard. She's someone who, it seems was very well liked by much of the Harvard faculty. Unlike Liz McGill, the president of Penn, who also resigned subsequent to these October 7th hearings, the October 7th Hamas attack and then the later hearings about anti-Semitism on elite campuses. She was someone who had been at Harvard for many years as dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So I wonder if you could talk to us just a bit about your understanding of her, having gotten to know her quite well through her academic work and just, you're kind of getting to know other folks who rubbed shoulders with her and what have you.
Yeah. So I think she does exemplify the kind of incremental refinement process I've been talking about, where she comes from Exeter, which I'm sure even back when she was there was pretty left-wing woke. Then she goes to universities. Her ideas are kind of further crystallized. And by the time she is a professor at Stanford and then Harvard, I think she's probably fully bought into much of this ideology. To me, what's more interesting about her, beyond either the ideological stuff or the questions about affirmative action and whether she was a beneficiary of it, is the fact that she really is a professional administrator. And this is a relatively recent development in the history of American higher education. The universities did not used to be run by this massive, bloated leviathan of non-faculty, right? Faculty used to be these kind of self-governing entities who more or less decided policy at universities, and now most of those decisions have been taken out of faculty hands and transferred into the hands of administrators, and that process has happened alongside a massive expansion in the number of administrators, which in turn has created a kind of entirely parallel career track where for scholars who they could choose kind of to go down one fork and just pursue serious scholarship, or they can just say, you know what, I'm not really going to be a professional scholar. I'm going to be a professional administrator instead. And Claudine Gay, I think, chose to do the second thing very early in her career, which is why she has so few publications. People are saying, well, that's because she's not smart or affirmative action. And look, that could be part of it, but that's, I think, not the main reason. It's more a function of the corporatization of the university and what kinds of opportunities and incentives that creates for young, ambitious scholars. So Claudine Gay decided to be a professional administrator, and as a result, she did a lot less writing and publication, and in that sense, I think is kind of an avatar for or a symbol of the problem of kind of administrative bloat, which is that it tends to suck away resources from scholarship and redirect them toward administrative functions. The bureaucracy becomes a kind of self-perpetuating parasite on the scholarly functions of the university. And how does that connect with ideology? Well, if you're trying to climb the ranks of administration, college administrators are uniformly liberal, more liberal even than faculty. You say what you think is politically advantageous, what people want to hear, and what was all the rage in 2019, 2020? Well, it was DEI. So what does Claudine Gay do as the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard? She creates the sort of inaugural Office of Equity, Inclusion, whatever, for the whole university. She makes a big show of announcing all these anti-racism initiatives. She also participates in the kind of bureaucratic defenestrations of a number of professors perceived to be on the wrong side of the new ideology. That includes Ronald Sullivan, a Harvard law professor who defended Harvey Weinstein, served on his defense team. It also includes Roland Fryer, who was allegedly punished for reasons related to Title IX, but many people believe was actually singled out because of his scholarship about race in the police. He found that police do use force against black suspects more than white suspects, but do not use lethal force against black suspects more than white suspects, which obviously upset some progressives. And she was involved in lots of other similar kind of bureaucratic demolitions behind the scenes, or at least that's kind of the word on the street. So, I think that in all of these criticisms of Gay are probably best understood as reflecting a much broader problem with modern university governance.
Just to put a fine point on it, as I understand it, people who were part of her PhD cohort say that in the early 1990s, when Gay was at Harvard, she was not notably radical. She was not someone who, at a time when Harvard's campus was alive with fights over critical legal studies, critical race theory, and what have you, she didn't seem to be one of the people who was most engaged. Is it fair to say that by the time she had established the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Harvard, that was no longer a particularly activist-y or controversial stance to take? It was actually kind of the safest careerist move?
Yes, it obviously was the safest move. I mean, not establishing it would have been perceived as an act of rebellion, right? Establishing it was just, well, this is what everyone's doing.
And of course, your reporting is centered on academic integrity. It's centered on Gay's record of plagiarism. But earlier this week, you reported that as dean of Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, in her core function as someone who is a professional administrator, Gay approved a set of rules in 2019 that made it harder to punish faculty for plagiarism, sanctioning them only if the plagiarism was committed knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about that and what you see as the reasoning behind that move. Did you garner any understanding of that from your reporting? Is this something that is a larger trend in trying to, kind of pull back, trying to, reduce the negative consequences that could stem from a plagiarism charge?
Well, it's worth noting in her defense that language comes directly from federal rules on research misconduct. And what it's designed to do is basically incorporate into Harvard's policies the standards that are operative for NIH-funded research. Because obviously the government has a whole Office of Research Integrity and a set of guidelines that it uses to adjudicate research misconduct claims related to government-funded research. So on the merits, it's not crazy that a university would just, in the course of rewriting and beefing up its research misconduct policy, incorporate language from the government so that it kind of tracks the agreed upon federal standard. It's not crazy, but it does represent a departure from the previous guidelines, which were just much more kind of bare bones and vague about what even constituted research misconduct, but which also really did not seem to indicate clearly that, I didn't mean to do it was a valid excuse. There was no explicit carve out for unintentional infractions. I doubt that she was thinking to herself, I've plagiarized all these times and I'm going to do this so that when I run for president of Harvard, they can't get, no, I don't think it was anything that diabolical, but I think it does say something about the bureaucratic cast of mind of people like Claudine Gay, that it doesn't even occur to them that, we're making our faculty plagiarism policy a lot more lax than the one for students. Is that fair? How might that, create problems in the future? Because if you compare the student and faculty policies, they are really, really different. The ones for
Talk
students.
To me about that.
Because
one of my gut instincts is that one of the reasons your reporting has been so powerful and one of the reasons you've been so good at penetrating these institutions as an interpreter of the culture of these institutions is that there are cleavages emerging within them. There are people who don't necessarily share your sensibilities on issue X or Y, who maybe adhere pretty closely to the progressive worldview, but who are really concerned about some of these questions about academic integrity and fairness. So I'm curious, that disjuncture you're describing between how students would be treated and faculty are being treated, did you find that there was some discomfort with that, some anger about that, some frustration?
Yeah, there was quite a bit. Some professors said this on the record to other publications. Some said it to me on the record. Many others, I think, expressed similar sentiments off the record. I think that for many people, what was so frustrating, it was two things. It was one, the double standard, the fact that students were being punished for things that the president of the university was getting a pass for until she resigned. But it was also that rather than just own up to what she did and say, look, I made a mistake, but it wasn't that bad, it was unintentional, whatever, they just tried to suppress the story and pretend it hadn't happened. First, they sent this insane threat of defamation to the New York Post, which seems to have deterred the publication from publishing any allegations for over a month, and then they kind of, when they eventually do acknowledge some concerns about plagiarism, they downplay them and they don't mention that this kind of cloak and dagger legal threat was ever made. And I think then when all of that comes out, my sense is that really pissed off the faculty, because they were mad, not just at Gay, but at the Harvard Corporation for being so opaque about the investigation and attempting to just squash this and shut it down. Even people inclined to defend her and say, oh, the plagiarism charges aren't that bad, were really upset with how the school handled it. And I think that is really when her support among faculty and students started to really wither. And had they just from the beginning said, yeah, we got these allegations, we went through the normal processes and decided that she needs to correct her work, but it wasn't done intentionally, so we'll cut her some slack. They'd all done that from the start. Maybe it would have ended differently, but they didn't. They did the polar opposite. And I think that really is part of what did her in.
Claudine Gay was a vocal proponent of racial preferences, which has been a major theme in the reaction to her resignation. You broke a story late last year about Columbia Law School apparently trying to evade the Supreme Court's ruling on racial preferences by requiring applicants to participate in video interviews. I wonder if you could talk about why exactly these selective elite institutions are so committed to racial preferences, even if that might pose some significant legal risk.
At universities, it's just been the norm for so long. Post Bakke, this was the decision that said you could use racial preferences, but only as a plus factor and only for the sake of pursuing diversity, not in order to do reparations or anything like that. That was ruled as explicitly not allowed. You could only do it for diversity's sake because diversity was a compelling government interest. And once that became the only allowable rationale, all these kind of bureaucracies shifted gear and started thinking of their work in terms of diversity. And then diversity, I think, kind of takes on a life of its own. And universities develop a kind of almost religious adherence to the value of diversity as a result of this one controlling opinion in a deeply divided, out of a deeply divided Supreme Court. As to, the Columbia thing, look, I don't think that cultural change happens overnight. These institutions have been living with this ideology as their governing kind of philosophy for many years. So I'm not that surprised that there's been resistance to it. I also do think that over time, if the diversity rationale in Justice Powell's opinion was enough to kind of spawn this entire conceptual architecture of diversity on college campuses, it's not crazy to think that the removal of that rationale, even if it doesn't destroy all of the ideology overnight, will kind of create space for there to be more reactions to it and more efforts to dismantle it. I do think the change in legal environment matters. But I would note that with other institutions, not so much universities, but government contractors, private businesses, et cetera, the law is kind of incoherent because on the one hand, you can't actually discriminate based on race. You can't use racial preferences. That's a no-no. But if the composition of your workforce is too out of proportion with the composition of the American population or the relevant uh, pool of qualified workers, and of course it's not always clear how that pool is delineated or established, those disproportions aren't necessarily sufficient grounds for a lawsuit, but they can be grounds, they can be evidence in a lawsuit, they can start to get the government interested, and there are these federal guidelines for, say, government contractors that say, if you have to set goals and timetables for remedying disparities in the racial composition of your workforce.
But you can't do that with explicit quotas. Somehow.
Yes, but you can't do that with explicit quotas. But if you don't meet the goals and timetables, again and again, well, maybe we have to start thinking about whether to investigate you or file a lawsuit. So it's the whole regime is kind of incoherent. Richard Hanania talks about this in his new book. Christopher Caldwell and others have made versions of this point. And so as a result, right, I think to be fair to these companies for a long time, they couldn't just totally ignore diversity considerations, given the state of the law. Now, I think more recently, especially as more of these reverse discrimination lawsuits have been filed, it's probably not really in their interest anymore, legally speaking, to do the crazy DEI stuff. They're probably more likely to get hit with a lawsuit for doing racial preferences than they are for allowing some degree of disproportion in
so now there's a counter pressure. It's not just pressure from the activist left.
Yeah.
There's also this other external political pressure.
Yeah, and I think you can make an argument that other pressure might even be stronger, considering that with this Supreme Court, they're probably more likely to get in trouble for doing explicit racial preferences than for just allowing racial disparities in hiring. But it's worth remembering that these sort of legal and cultural forces also shaped activist investors like BlackRock. And so BlackRock, right, at least for a while, took the attitude, well, if we don't see corporate diversity on your corporate boards, we might oust your board members or do these shareholder proxy votes that screw you over. So I think eventually a lot of the pressure on these elite institutions to do DEI came not so much from hypothetical legal threats from the activist left, but from very concrete investor threats from BlackRock and Vanguard. And that may also be starting to change as now there's been a much more concerted Republican effort to go after ESG, and as I think DEI and ESG have become kind of politically toxic slogans due to the work of, for example, your colleague Chris Rufo. But look, I also think that the role of kind of big investors is as important, and perhaps more so at this point in C-suites than the role of just hostile environment law or what have you.
I wonder, you wrote a really absorbing piece for the Free Press last year about how law school students are remaking the American legal system. We spoke earlier on about Yale Law School. We've spoken just now about Columbia Law School. And it seems, you reported that recent graduates are declining to represent unpopular defendants and believe procedural rights should be subordinated to the imperatives of racial justice. How worried are you about the future of our legal system? How pervasive are these ideas in elite law firms, in the Justice Department, in prosecutors' offices nationwide? I'm curious about this transmission belt and how formidable it is.
I mean, I certainly think it's concerning, and in fact, the progressive prosecutor movement is one very clear manifestation of what progressive policies look like when instantiated in law. It looks like we just don't prosecute violent crime, and cities like DC are allowed to be turned into, at least parts of them are allowed to be turned into dystopian hellscapes where carjackings occur with abandon. I mean, that's a very, that doesn't threaten the stability of the United States, but it's bad, and it leads to lots of preventable deaths and billions of dollars lost, right, in tax revenue and economic growth when people decide, we're not going to invest in DC because no one wants to live there, since they don't want to get carjacked, right? I mean, those are real concerns. In terms of the broader question of can we maintain the integrity of a legal system that's built on principles of adversarial competition and robust representation, the good news is that in law, unlike medicine, there exists a very strong kind of conservative counter-establishment in the form of the Federalist Society that I suspect will for the foreseeable future prevent a scenario in which just right-wing clients can't get legal representation. We're not there or even that close to being there. But what may happen is that it becomes harder for anyone other than very kind of prominent right-wing clients who can afford, Cooper Kirk or some of these kind of various conservative legal boutiques, just the average Joe on the street who gets in trouble over a DEI dispute at work or something like that. I think there's now more money in doing the reverse discrimination litigation, for example, so they probably can get representation. But, I do worry about a scenario in which just the balance of resources in the legal system is so skewed towards the left, right? Like all the big law firms are really left-wing. If one side just systematically has access to more lawyers and better legal representation, we may not get to a scenario where just conservative, like the idea that conservatives aren't going to have a lawyer. I mean, that's far-fetched and not true, but you may get to a scenario where just the left just constantly gets access to more top lawyers than the right. And that can make a difference, especially when it comes to pro bono work, right? Firms will they'll require, in many cases, attorneys to do pro bono work, but they'll only approve pro bono work that is progressive. And so that results in organizations like Planned Parenthood effectively getting all sorts of free legal counsel from Gibson Dunn or what have you, which they would, which Feminists for Life isn't going to get. So things like that, kind of those sorts of imbalances, I think are concerning. And the other place you see it, it's sort of related to progressive prosecutors, but it's different, is, what do judges do? Or what do federal regulators who make rules do? There have already been cases in which judges have basically cited the language as the riots are the language of the unheard line from MLK to justify giving BLM rioters lower sentences than what the prosecution asked for. And again, is that stuff existential? No, but it's bad, and we don't want to live in a legal system where people are, the length of time that they're locked up or not is kind of contingent on the political valence of their misdeeds. And to be fair, I think that that's a concern. There's a lot of polarization right now, and I'm sure there are right-wing judges, et cetera, who one could plausibly argue, hey, are they going to be a little too soft on the January 6th folks, for example, just as one can, and indeed people have argued, that left-wing judges are being too hard on the January 6th people. And that, I think, reflects another issue with the whole conversation, which is just the legal system is not immune from cultural and political forces. And as our country becomes more polarized, and the vital center kind of hollows out, I mean, I think that just is going to have downstream effects on the culture of law and on the legal system.
Aaron, you are
concerning.
an investigative journalist, and so this next question might be a little unfair, but I'll go for it anyway. You have described a set of kind of concerning circumstances. You've also described the interaction between Supreme Court decisions, between civil rights legislation and how they are interpreted by administrative agencies. When you think about a formula for change, when you think about how we might remedy some of these concerning circumstances you raise, what do you think is a plausible agenda, or what are some elements of a plausible agenda for redressing some of these maladies stemming from the pervasiveness of DEI in elite academia?
Well, Um, you mentioned that I'm an investigative journalist, and although I don't have any concrete proposal to clone myself or recruit a massive army of fellow kind of right-wing investigative journalists to the Washington Free Beacon, what I would say is that I actually do think that sunlight is the best disinfectant in a lot of cases, and I have been surprised by the ability of just reporting facts to really make change. You mentioned Columbia. Well, after I asked them for comments, I didn't even publish my story yet. I just asked them for comments. And within 3 hours, they told me, this was all put online by mistake. We're not actually doing this thing. That totally is not a smokescreen for racial preferences. Definitely not. It's not a smokescreen for racial preferences, but to be clear, we're definitely not doing it. We're not racist. Don't sue us. That was more or less the reaction. All from a single request for comment. And I mentioned the racially discriminatory COVID triage policies. Those largely went by the wayside after I reported on them. I basically helped topple Claudine Gay by just reporting on her plagiarism. I say all that not to pat myself on the back, but to point out that you actually can do a lot by just exposing the rot. And if more people were doing that in a more systematic way, I do think that even without sort of passing new laws or changing institutions, institutions would change as a result of the greater systematic scrutiny. Indeed, I think you can argue that the left's monopoly on the mainstream media is one reason why, for all the concern about right-wing extremism, I actually think most mainstream conservative institutions are very good at self-policing overall. I don't say that as I'm not saying, oh, how dare they exile this or that conservative gadfly? Why was John Derbyshire let go of National Review or whatever? I'm saying it's like probably positive that these institutions gatekeep, but part of why they have historically gatekeeped is that they were under relentless scrutiny from a liberal hegemonic press. And as those media conditions have changed and there's the press has just less cachet among conservatives, and as there's more fracturing and decentralization and more of these sort of insurgent right-wing media outlets, I think that's actually changed the incentive structures that conservative institutions have, which may explain why certain people who were canceled or would have been canceled 10, 20 years ago are now increasingly maybe not being canceled, or even in some cases, which I won't name, being rehabilitated. So that's just to say, I think actually the media environment matters. And so by reshaping the media environment, would-be conservative reporters could, in fact, change the incentive structures that mainstream institutions face, and that might, make them more sane.
Just to be explicit about it, Aaron, so I'm curious, when you think about the mechanism through which investigative journalism is operating on this environment, you talked before about this, you were alluding to this disjuncture between democratic politics. You could have a Democratic majority saying, hey, we're pretty skeptical about progressive prosecutors, and yet because of this transmission mechanism from elite institutions into these powerful bureaucracies, it almost doesn't matter. There's a level of insulation from what we might think of as democratic politics. So are you saying that with this investigative journalism, embarrassing elite institutions, embarrassing people within these bureaucracies, within these universities, has some power on, call it the swing vote within the elite? Is that kind of how it works?
Yes. And in fact, the New York Times had a really good piece reporting on kind of the inside story of how the Harvard Corporation decided to junk Claudine Gay. And it was exactly this. The initial allegations of plagiarism and anti-Semitism created some headaches, but they weren't that big a deal. I think people frankly didn't like that they were coming from Chris Rufo and Bill Ackman, and there was a sort of rally around the flag effect. We must pretend Claudine Gay and the integrity of our institution from the evil right-wing donors who want to destroy it, blah, blah, blah. But then the plagiarism allegations mounted, and the malfeasance and perfidy of the Harvard Corporation was revealed. And at that point, not only were faculty and students saying, hey, this is really untenable, she has to go, but when the Harvard Corporation members went back to their vacation homes in Palm Beach and Nantucket and what have you, and Aspen, Colorado, according to the New York Times, they got kind of deluged by friends and family who were saying, hey guys, what the hell are you doing keeping Claudine Gay? Like, this woman is a total embarrassment. And then once they were facing personal humiliation and they had been kind of humiliated in the eyes, not just of conservatives, but in the eyes of their peers, of people who they respect and regard as moral and political equals, that is when they decided, Penny Pritzker, call Claudine Gay, we're not doing this anymore. So this is a case study in exactly the phenomenon you're describing. And from what I understand, I think this is common, right? When the right-wing reporting reaches escape velocity and enters into the Washington Post, and Ruth Marcus says of DEI administrators at Yale or Stanford Law School, you people are behaving like children, what the hell is wrong with you? Usually those DEI officers are gone within a few months, because Stanford Law School may not care what I at the Washington Free Beacon think. They care what Ruth Marcus at the Washington Post thinks. So when they says, you're a baby, why are you paying hundreds of thousands a year to these babies who foment student revolts over nonsense, suddenly their staffing changes. So yes, I really have seen up close how the journalism can make a big difference. Your question was broader than that. There's other legal things that could be done. It's not all just about media, but I would argue that the media is actually an important part of the story.
It does seem like that has been a real pressure point. And I suppose another way to think about it is that part of what you've done is raise the relative status and prestige of a certain perspective, by establishing the legitimacy of this critique of progressive racialism. That actually matters over the long term in terms of attracting high talent people who will be capable of taking on leadership roles and exerting some influence within these institutions. I wonder if actually that, when you look at elite academia and its outsized role in our public life, I wonder if your instinct is partly, well, that outsized role is the problem. You do see some talk from conservative lawmakers, which actually echoes talk that you once heard from folks on the progressive left about endowment taxes, about other ways to try to curb some of the privileges associated with running these, kind of really large, well-endowed institutions. I wonder what you think about that, because of course there's one line of argument that, well, wait a second, this is illiberal. These entities create massive positive spillovers. Their autonomy is something that is rooted in a longstanding American tradition. But then another argument is that, hey, this brand of elitism actually promotes a certain kind of cultural dysfunction that now takes on call it a progressive political cast. So I just wonder if you have an instinct on that. Do we fight eliteness? Is eliteness the problem? Or is it the fact that these elite institutions aren't living up to the right set of values?
Well, it's more the latter, in the sense that there's always going to be an elite. And so, if your theory of the case is, well, we just can't have elites because elites are bad. Well, sorry, but no society in history has ever worked that way. So that's a non-starter. However, I do think that, well, there always are going to be elites. Elites haven't always been this incompetent or hubristic. And B, universities haven't always had quite as much power as they currently do. A college degree is more important for one's life prospects now than it used to be. I think that's largely because it's really a signaling thing, and it signals intelligence, and it would be ideal if we could just do direct IQ tests and not use the college degree signal. But since the Supreme Court has said that IQ tests are racist, we can't do that. It's another story. But look, you also see these universities get involved in policing so-called disinformation, and I think there's some Stanford center that was very involved in the censorship of Twitter and Facebook and Google. You see these kinds of public-private partnerships with universities where the distinction between, a private institution that receives hundreds of millions in federal aid and which colludes with the government to censor wrongthink, the distinction between that on the one hand and the government itself is kind of, it's ridiculous to even draw the distinction. They're public in all but name. That wasn't quite the case, at least not to the same degree, in past generations. And I think that, well, getting rid of elites is impossible, making universities a little less important, that seems very doable. And I would note, too, that we often see this where culture wars and kind of norm degeneration tends to happen when the stakes of controlling a given institution become too high. And a great example is the Supreme Court, right? After Roe v. Wade, when the Supreme Court arrogated to itself the right to determine when human life and human rights begin, suddenly you see the confirmation battle of Bork. Then you see McConnell saying we're just not going to consider any Obama judges. Then you see the crazy confirmation battles over Brett Kavanaugh. And so one can go back to any one of those examples and say, that was the moment when really it was turning point, the norms degenerated, blah, 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 and blame progressives or conservatives, whichever you like. But I think the better way to look at it is just the Supreme Court was getting really powerful, and it just mattered more who controlled the Supreme Court. And that created an incentive for people to employ hitherto unemployed weapons. So I think that is a big part of what's happened with universities. And in general, people who are, for example, angry that Bill Ackman or Chris Rufo are putting pressure on Harvard should consider, well, if you don't want them to be the subject of these culture wars, how do you make them less important? How do you make it so that it's no longer rational for Chris Rufo to invest so much time in ginning up pressure campaigns against them? I think that's the more important question. And same token, public health agencies, right? Like, well, why are Republicans, interfering and trying to regulate medicine? Well, let's see. Maybe because the public health establishment tried to shut down, the entire economy and told people they had to stay in their homes, except for protesting about BLM. That's okay, right? Like, they kind of did this to themselves. And in each case, from public health to the university to the Supreme Court, it was always a kind of institutional power grab that resulted in the outside scrutiny and the attempts to rein these things in, which isn't to say that all of those attempts have been good or that they've struck the right balance between institutional autonomy and democratic accountability. But you get these fights when an institution gets too big for its britches. So I would say to universities, look, you don't want Republicans to do this to you again. Well, you've got to kind of totally reconceptualize your role in American life, or this stuff is going to keep happening.
They're two different, I think, complementary points you're driving at. One is that when you look to these institutions that are concerned about their legitimacy bleeding away, part of what you're saying is that, well, look, try to adhere to norms of free speech, try to become a bit more pluralistic and open, and think carefully about jeopardizing your reputation for excellence and openness. But on the other hand, you're saying that, look, to the extent these institutions are so narrow, ideological, reproducing this really kind of narrow perspective in a way that is sapping their legitimacy, the rest of us should try to cabin their influence to some degree, right? So you have different advice for the institutions themselves and for those of us outside of those institutions who are looking to think about the influence of these ideas on American society writ large. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your superb reporting, which has done so much good. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Reihan.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Reihan Salam.